Today we're going to be learning Ketubot daf Yud Zayin. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to start at the very bottom of Tet Zayin and Beit. Very well-known line because we sing it at weddings all the time. Tanu Rabban, bright quotes. Ketzab mirakdim lifnei kallah. How do we dance before the kallah? Surprisingly, the question is not what type of dance do we do, but what do we say? Apparently, they would sing something to the kallah while they would dance before her. What words did they say? Beit Shamai omrim kallah kemot shehi. You say it as it is. What does that mean? You're honest. If the kallah is beautiful, you say she's beautiful. If she has good, certain traits, whatever you want to say, you say what's true, but you don't try to gloss over what's not true and say, oh, yeah, she's really something special when she's not really. Okay, again, obviously everything is subjective, but you can read Rashi, Kimochi, Lefi, Yofia, Bechashivuta, Mekasinota. They praised her according to what her capabilities are, what is actually true. Beit Hillel omrim, kallah na'eh v'chasuda. Okay, now you might know the song. The song actually only quotes Beit Hillel and not Beit Shamai. What does Beit Hillel mean when they say that? All kalot are beautiful. All kalot have beautiful things one can say about them. On that day, they shine. Only good things come in. So, everything about them is beautiful on that day. Again, beautiful doesn't only mean physical beauty. We're talking about inner beauty as well. And therefore, anything you say, right, you can basically say anything because on that day, she is something special. Amru lahem Beit Shammai leBeit Hillel. Beit Shammai say to Beit Hillel, and I would say a little bit of a warning, be prepared when you're going to hear this. Harei shayta chigeret o suma. Okay, if she's missing a leg or she's blind, omrim la kallah na'eh v'chasuda. You're going to say she's beautiful, right? Of course, we all know people who are missing a leg or are blind can be beautiful just as well. But I guess here they seem to be talking about physical perfection. Maybe they're saying, obviously, nobody's perfect anyway. Well, whatever. Let's just put that aside. And kind of, sometimes you have to just swallow things that are said in the Gemara, even if they might somewhat bother you or majorly bother you. So he says, Beit Shammai says, you're going to say, kallah na'eh v'chasuda, Torah amra. Here comes Beit Shammai's big claim. The Torah says, midvar sheker torchak, stay away from lying. You can't say that. Amru lahem Beit Hillel leBeit Shammai. Beit Hillel says to Beit Shammai, without directly answering them, they say like this, l'divrechem, according to what you're saying. So you're going to say the following. Okay, again, we see this comparison of purchasing. Okay, again, it doesn't mean that we're purchasing women here. They're just bringing a comparison from a different realm. If somebody bought something from the shuk that you thought was ugly, so yishabchenu beinav, oh, yiganenu beinav, what you're going to say, oh, what you bought is really disgusting, or you'll say, oh, that's really nice, right? Maybe it'll be a little bit hidden in your tone, but you'll at least try to say, oh, that's so nice. And, maybe it would brighten up this area in the house, even though, you're not really so sure. You try to find something positive, right? He said, what are you going to do? You're going to do that? Or you're going to say, that's really awful what you just bought. Right? Obviously, you're going to try to make the person feel good about what they just purchased. You should always be pleasant with other people. Okay, you should always try to do things in a pleasant manner, try to make people feel good about things, try not to be too critical, right? So you have a bride who maybe isn't exactly perfect, but you can always find positive things to say, right? We compared at the beginning of the Masechet, weddings to funerals. I think here, to me, in my head, I always think about how you go to a funeral and you always see this beautiful picture of the person, even people who were difficult people in their lifetimes. Maybe they'll allude to it a little bit in the funeral so as to be honest about things. I've been places where they've done that. But for the most part, you hear beautiful, beautiful things about a person because there's always good things that you can find about them. When Rav Dimi came, he said, right, when he came from Israel to Babylonia, this is how they dance before the kallah as they sing, actually, masharu, they sing like from Shiur. This is how they sing before the kallah in Israel. Lo kachal, velo schak, velo pirkus. We don't need your eyeshadow, your face makeup, not any of, right? You don't need any kind of jewelry, anything. Right, sorry, pirkus is hair braiding. Okay, the kachal is the eyeshadow, like kachol blue. The strak is the rouge on her cheeks, the whatever you call it. I'm so not a makeup person, I always forget my words. But the pirkus is braiding of the hair. So all those things, right? In other words, they would say, you don't need this, you don't need that, and yet you're so beautiful, like a beautiful ibex. Okay, right? Everybody always looks at ibex and say, wow, how beautiful they are. Now we have a funny thing, or at least a little bit strange. When they gave smicha to Rabbi Zera, they said the same thing to him, even though it sounds like a very feminine type of compliment. Right? You're beloved by everybody, even though you don't need any external things to make you look beautiful, right? You're beautiful from the inside. If they're already talking about smicha, when they gave smicha to certain rabbis, when they gave smicha to Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi, they sang the following. Anybody like this guy and anybody like that guy should definitely be deserving of smicha. Lana, but smuchulana, you should give smicha to them. Lana is to them. Usually it's lan, but here it's lana. Lo tismechulana, lo min sarmisin, velo min sarmitin. Okay, I read this all because they're very complicated words. They're even confusing. People don't know exactly how to translate them, but we'll go with Rashi on this. Don't give smicha, not for the sarmisin. Rashi says it comes from the lashon saras, to cut, okay, or to switch the order. These are people who are misarsin halachot behefech tamehen. They chop up halachot and flip the logic of one and use it for the other. Okay, they get confused with their proofs. Velomin sarmitin. Rashi says lashon smartutin, like shmatas, okay, like rags. Ve'amre la'lomen achmisin, omrim chamishitatam. They're fifths people. They're people who tell you only a fifth of the answers, of the reasons. Ve'lomen atormusin. Rashi says, okay, Rashi says lo itparish. We don't really know how this translates. And then there's in parentheses, they say tormusim, or a type of, some people say they're bitter. They're kitniot that are bitter, like a kind of grain. Rashi, in the parentheses here, it says anashim reikanim, empty people. Okay, so anyway, all kinds of people you shouldn't give smicha to. When he would go from the yeshiva to the house of the Kesar, so he was in contact with the house of the Kesar. The mothers, meaning the women from the Roman Caesar's house, would come out and they would sing to him the following thing. They admired him a lot. Biaval was known to have a lot of relations with the Roman emperor. And they'd say, Rabba da'ame, a great person within his nation, umidabrana du'umate. This is just redundant. It's a poetic way of saying the same thing. He's a leader of his nation. Butsina dinahora, he's the candle that brings light. Baruch mate l'shalom. Baruch bo'acha l'shalom, right? Blessed be your entrance into here in peace, right? May you enter in peace. Amru alav, okay, here they're just talking about compliments, right? That people say, that people sing to other people, starting with the kallah, and we got to all sorts of other people. Amru alav Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli, Shaya notel, this is the general Rabbi Yehuda that we quote in the Mishna all the time. He's the son of Rabbi Eli. Now we're going to have a whole slew of stories of rabbis who dance before kallah. Okay, so if you think about all these weddings, separate dancing, separate this, and rabbis wouldn't go near the women, all of a sudden you're going to see a bunch of sugyot that seem very different, and describing a very different type of world. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli would take a branch, a myrtle branch, and would dance before the kallah with it. He would say the words, you're kallah, you're beautiful, right? A beautiful kallah. Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak merakel atzlat. Okay, he would take 3 hadassim, 3 branches. Some people say he was juggling, okay, and he would juggle them. Amar Rabbi Zera kamachsif lan saba. Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak is embarrassing himself, right? It's not appropriate for a Talmid Chacham to do juggling, right? That's not appropriate. Hinach nafshe, wait till the end of the story. When he died, Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, who did this, all of a sudden there was a pillar of fire that separated between him and the rest of the people. This only happens to 1 or 2 people in a generation. Okay, meaning it was clear he was a great person. And obviously, whether it was because he did that or despite the fact that he did it, meaning it didn't take away from his Torah and from him being an amazing person, the fact that he juggled at a wedding, right? All the more so it adds to it, right? That he's in contact with the people and he's being, right, knowing when it's appropriate to be serious and when it's appropriate not to be serious. Amar Rabbi Zera, Hanyale Shutina Shutite Desaba. So the reaction of Rabbi Zera when he saw this, after he had said, what are you doing? And you're embarrassing yourself. He now says, and we're going to have 3 versions of this. Apparently the Shutite Desaba, which is a shota, is a branch. The branch of this elder man, right, obviously gave him this chuyot that this is, why did this pillar of fire? He basically said it must be that's what did it. Because what made him unique than the other rabbis? It was really this. So this must have been it. Some people say it was his shtut, his silliness. That's what gave it to him. His approach, okay? His way of, right, his custom. This was his unique way of doing things. Okay, now we get even more. Forget about dancing for the kallah, forget about commenting on her beauty, but now Rav Acha carried her on his shoulders and danced with her. Okay, by the way, these things, it's actually interesting. These things would never go today for 2 reasons. Number one, part of the world has gone more to the right and, distance from all these things. And in fact, the poskim say, we no longer do this because there's no way people could do this without having thoughts about other women. And we're just not the same way people used to be. And maybe rabbis then able to control themselves. We can't anymore. And therefore we would never do this anymore. So that's number one. Number two, if you go more modern, last number of years, right, we're much more careful about separation between men and women, especially when you're talking about leaders and rabbis and all the concerns for all sorts of abuse and everything else, right? We definitely make sure to keep distance between particularly rabbis or leaders of the generation and people of the opposite sex to make sure that there's no anything going misconduct. Okay, so that's 2 interesting directions of how this has and kind of must change really because of that. Okay, let's move on. Or let's keep on. So he would put her on his shoulders. Amar le Rabbanan, anan ma'u l'mei bar hachi. Says, can we do this? So Amar lehu, he said to them, idam yalalchem kekishura l'chayet. This again, you might not like this term, but what does it mean? If she's like you, if she is to you like a being, meaning you don't have any feelings for her, you're just looking at it as, oh, I'm just putting the kallah on my shoulders in order to make this wedding very exciting, then it's totally fine. V'lo, lo. But if not, then you can't do this. Okay, so you have to know yourself. And that's why, again, it's very easy to say that, but in practice, not everybody knows themselves well enough, or, the halacha at a certain point kind of said, well, we don't do this anymore. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonatan mutar l'stakel b'fnei kallah kol shiva kedei lechaveva al ba'ala. This is another interesting one. You can look at a woman and say, oh, wow, look, this bride is so beautiful, because the more people talk about how beautiful the bride is, the more the husband believes how beautiful his bride is. And so we want to make sure that the marriage is successful and the husband feels good about it. So you're allowed to do that, but we don't hold that way. Some of the commentaries say, well, if we don't hold that way, didn't we say that they have to see, that they can testify? We'll see this also later today about her hinuma and things like that, meaning they had to have looked at her. So some people distinguish between looking and looking. There's a way to look and there's a way to look. Looking, glancing toward her, yes, no problem. But looking at her in a way that you're looking at her beauty and marveling over her beauty, that already we don't do. Tanu Rabbanan. Ma'avirin et hamet milifnei kallah. If there's a dead body going out, a procession for a funeral, and the kallah is walking, you move the dead body out of the way so that you don't interfere with the happiness of the kallah. And if there's a king coming, then you move away the kallah and the mate and allow the king to go through. There was a story told of Agrippus, the king, he moved to let the kallah go through. Gemara is going to have issues with this. First, they say that the rabbis praised him for doing this. Shibchuhu sounds like Michlal de Shapir Avad. He did the right thing. Rav Ashi said, even if you say that a nasi, an important, prominent person, a prince, that says, okay, you don't have to give me respect, that's fine. But the king does not have the ability to say, I don't care about forego his respect. Not allowed, because the king, his fear has to be upon the people. He can't just say, oh, I can give up my honor. So how did Agrippas move away for the kallah? To which the Gemara answers, Parshat Darachim Abai. It was an intersection. He could have gone this way, he could have gone that way. He went that way to avoid the kallah, but nobody knew what path he was taking. It's not like nowadays, if the president's coming through, everybody knows exactly what path the president is taking because they close off the streets and that's all planned. And if he moves and switches routes, it'll be obvious. In those days, obviously, they didn't have such things, no Secret Service, right? They basically, he would just turn the other way. It looked as if it was natural and nobody realized. So then it was okay. Tanu Rabbanit. Mivatlim Talmud Torah le'hotzaat hamet u'lachnasat kallah. This is a very fascinating halacha. Talmud Torah is always the most important thing. You can't be what we call mevatel Torah, stop learning Torah, but you can for certain things. For what things? In order to go to a funeral or to bring in a kallah to her wedding. Again, we see him. They said about him, he would do the following. He would stop learning Torah in order to go to funerals and weddings. The Beit says, when it was this time back, if there aren't enough people to go, okay, if there were enough people other than him, so now we get to a big question. We've actually seen this sugya before. We saw it in Masechet Megillah. So what is kol tzorko? Amar Rav Shmuel bar Ani mishmei derav treiser alpei gavra b'shita alpei shipurim. 12,000 people and 6,000 of them blowing the shofar. If you have all that, you don't have to go. Okay, ready? That's a very big funeral, okay, or a wedding. Here they're talking specifically about funerals. Some people say it was 13,000 people, uminayu, and from that, shita alpei shipurim. Of those people, 6,000 shofar blowers. Okay, so it's not 12,000 plus 6,000, it's 13,000. Within that, there's 6,000 who are blowing the shofar. Ula amal, he gives a different answer. If when you made a line of all the people, they would make a chaytze like melashon mechitza. They would make a mechitza, a barrier, a partition of people from the gate of the city, that's the abula, until the sichra, until the grave. So if you have that many people, again, it all depends how far the cemetery was from the city. If you had a straight line of people going from there, that would be enough. The giving of the Torah is like the taking away of the Torah, which is basically when a Talmid Chacham dies. So what does that mean? The Torah was given with 600,000 people. Also taking away the Torah, meaning the funeral of a Talmid Chacham should be with 600,000 people. But what kind of Talmid Chacham are we talking about? Okay, now we're going to start distinguishing. We're going to have two distinctions. Number one, this whole sugya is about stopping Talmud Torah in order to go to a funeral. Doesn't talk about stopping your work to go to a funeral. That seems like maybe you need to do that no matter what. Then the question is going to be for who and what are the numbers based on how many people are expected at a particular funeral to say you no longer need to go. So if it's Talmid Chacham, 600,000. If there's not 600,000 people, you have to go. And this reminds me of those huge funerals of the Gedolei Ador when they die, and how many people show up. That's for someone who learns, and he learns Torah, he learns Mishna, turning out a Beit, but he doesn't teach. Someone who's just a Talmid Chacham that they learn, 600,000. Someone who's a Talmid Chacham who also teaches, there's no amount. Everybody has to come out. Can't start doing calculations. Oh, you have enough people without. Okay, so now that's it for this sugya, but there's a lot of interesting things in the commentaries about in terms of how we paskin. So number one, they say someone who doesn't learn at all, then maybe as long as there's a minyan of people, you don't need to go. Okay, if it's not someone who learns, to which the Shulchan Aruch says that basically everyone nowadays learns something, and therefore, okay, in his day, again, question whether this would be relevant nowadays, but since everybody learns something, everyone is in the category of the 600,000. That basically, unless there's 600,000, everybody really is commanded to go. And then that applies to all people. I'll read you from the Shulchan Aruch. It's actually very interesting. Just pull it up 1 second. In Yoredea, it's chapter 361, Seif 1, in the Shulchan Aruch. He says here, what about women? Okay, so it's a great line. So first of all, he says, Everybody learns either Tanakh or Mishnah at least. And that's the two that we talked about before. That's quoted in the name of the Beit Yosef. And then it says, Isha, what about a woman? Some people say, and this is way back in the 1500s when people weren't learning, right? Women weren't learning. Some people say she is in the category of those who learn Torah and Mishnah, and therefore she can't. Anyone can go to her, right? Should go to her funeral. Some people say, no, it's not, because she doesn't really learn. Okay, unfortunately, he said, and that's really the prevalent custom. But why? Okay, we'd rather err on the side of not being mevatel, Torah, Talmud Torah, and allow us to go. Okay, then there's the issue of what if you're working? So if you're working, some people say you have to go out if it's someone in your city. You have to go to any funerals in the city. It becomes a big issue. So why aren't people going to funerals all the time, according to this, right? It sounds like anyone who learns, you have to go to their funeral. And even anyone who doesn't learn now is considered as someone who learns, and therefore you need to go to all funerals. First of all, it'd be kind of crazy, right? Especially if it's, let's say, all funerals in your city. If you live in a big city, wow, you'll be at funerals all the time. So some people limit this to only if you see the funeral going, you have to go. You can't ignore it, you have to go. If you don't see it, so it's fine. Okay, or if it's someone who's a real gadol b'Torah, okay, a real Talmud scholar. Okay, next, okay, if we go back to the Mishnah, turn back, Mishnah at the beginning of the chapter on Tefav Beit, it said, Isha shenit almana, nit armala, o nit garsha, right? And then she says she became a widow or divorcee. And she says nobody knew. She says betulani setani. Okay, she claims I was a betula when I got married, and he says, no, you're an almana. If there were edim that said she had this hinuma, which we're going to see exactly what is hinuma, or her hair was uncovered, then she gets to claim, right? She's right. And if we have edim to support her claim, then it's okay. So my hinuma, surcha bar papa mishmei deze'ere yamal tanura da'asa. It's a canopy over her head. Okay, it must have been some sort of tiara that she would wear. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, kiryata de minamnaba kalata. It's a kiryata that the woman would sleep underneath. Okay, what does this mean? Good question. There's different opinions. Some people say it's also some sort of tiara. Kiryata is usually a city. It was a city. We saw this tiara that women used to wear called, I think it was called Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. Saw in Masechet Shabbat about things that women could go out with or not. So this tiara on her head, we talked about that they would wear, it was like a city, and it was something that generally the brides wore. Some people say it's a veil that covered her. And both things covered her when she would kind of sleep under them. I don't know exactly why they're pointing that out, but sleeping is just kind of describing what it was. So those things are all signs of things that betulot wore, virgins wore when they got married. And therefore, if you could test, there were witnesses that said, we remember she wore this at her wedding, then you'd know that she was really a betulah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer. Now we get back to the Mishnah again. He said, okay, if they gave out parched, toasted grains, that was something they did only at weddings of virgins. To which they say, Tana, they bring a braita, but that all based on the custom. That was in Yehuda, which they were talking about in the Mishnah. But what about, right, in Judea? What about in Babylonia? We don't do that in weddings. Amarav, darduge de mishcha aresha de Rabbanan. Talk about other strange customs. Okay, if they put oil, the women would put oil and smear oil into the heads of the rabbis. Okay, talk about negia, touching. Okay, they would put the oil on their heads, right? We saw the rabbis putting the brides on their shoulders. Now we see women rubbing oil into rabbis' heads. Not only do we think this is strange, but Amar le Rav Papa la Abaye, mishcha de chafifuta ka'amar. Are you talking about rubbing oil like shampooing into their heads? Like you would do with shampoo? That's Papa says to Abaye, what on earth are you talking about? To which Abaye says to Rav Papa, you have to remember, Abaye was an orphan. Abaye says to Rav Papa, Amar le Yatma, you, Rav Papa, must be an orphan. Lo avda lach imach darduge mishcha aresha de Rabbanan b'shat ma'aseh. Did your mother not do this at your wedding? In other words, you must be an orphan because your mother didn't do what every other mother does for a child, right? Interesting that Abaye is saying that about Rav Papa when Abaye himself was an orphan and didn't have and his mother wasn't at his wedding. Anyway, he says, where were you at your wedding? Like, didn't this happen at your wedding? Rabbanan, like they said, they're going to now bring some cases. There was a Talmid Chacham, he married up his son to the house of Rabbi Bar Ula. Or Rabbi Bar Ula married his son off to the daughter of this rabbi. And they did that. They rubbed oil into the heads of the rabbis during the wedding. So now, if we want to have testimony to the woman's an almanah, let's say the husband wants to say, I don't want to give you 200 zuz, and he wants to bring proof. So what kind of proof can you bring of what's unique about weddings of widows? Tane, or non-betulot, non-versions. Tane Rav Yosef, armelata lele kisane. They don't have these kisane. So some people say the kisane are the klayot. They don't have these toasted grains. So you can testify there were no toasted grains at the wedding. There's a few other interpretations here, but I'm not going to go into it. They're just trying to find a sign of, here it's an interesting sign because who could remember what wasn't, right? It's always easier to testify about what was. Not always do we accept testimony about what was. And here it seems to be, at least according to this version of the text, that they would. Okay, back to the Mishnah. Now we say, the Mishnah had switched topics in the middle. It's kind of similar, but then now they said, we're talking about a different topic about actually purchasing something. Rabbi Yehoshua admits that what? If somebody comes and says, this field that I'm living in was your father's, but I purchased it from him, he's believed. Why? Because without him saying anything, he has rights to land. He's sitting on the land. So the fact that he told us it was your father's, but I bought it from him, that makes him believed because he's the one who, if he hadn't said anything, he would have rights to living on the land because he's living there right now. So the fact that he told us that he purchased it and then says, but I purchased, right, the fact that he admits that it was yours, but then says, but I purchased it from your father, that makes him believable. However, if there were witnesses that already testified to the fact that it belonged to your father beforehand, and he says, I bought it from him, okay, that was the mission. Then he's not believed because it's not a pesha asal. Witnesses already were testifying against him. Okay, so only when he comes forward with more information than if we hadn't had that information, we wouldn't have even had a doubt about him, then we believe him. So now we want to understand why the Mishnah specifically gave a case where he says, I purchased it from your father. Why didn't he just say, it was yours and I purchased it from you? And it was not, it was your father's and I purchased it from your father. This was your field. And I bought it from you. Because of the second part. And it's not going to be clear right away why they're saying this. We're going to have to explain it later. Just to take it at this point, the Gemara actually has a claim, even though this doesn't really make so much sense. It's because of the second part. We don't yet know why the second part had to be in the version of the father. But when it says at the end of the Mishnah, if he has witnesses, it's his. And he says, but I bought it from him, then eino ne'eman. So now, if you had said, right, if there were witnesses that said it was yours, but I bought it from you, okay, that because of that, we didn't want to say that part in the case of I bought it from you, it wouldn't work. Therefore, we said I bought it from your father. Now, it's not so clear why, so hold off. I don't understand they're saying. If now, when it comes to land and ownership of land, if you lived in the land for 3 years and then you claim, but I don't have a document that proves that I purchased it, we assume that you just lost your document. You probably lose documents after 3 years, right? Nowadays, it's usually have to keep things 7 years. In those days, probably less, right? They didn't have more storage or anything. And anyway, mice could eat things. So if after 3 years you've been living in the land and nobody's complained, that's what we call chazaka. We'll get to this in Perek Chaz Karabatim and Baba Batra, and you get to stay in the land. So now they say the following. If he ate the produce for 3 years, he was living there and nobody stopped him, Amai Lo Hamer. Why wouldn't he believe? Of course, he's believed, even if witnesses said it belonged to someone else before, it doesn't matter. You were living there for 3 years and no one complained. Again, the assumption is within those 3 years, someone would have complained if they claimed it was their land. If they didn't complain, it's proof that it must be yours, even without having a shtar to show for it, a document. And if you didn't eat there for 3 years, obviously you're not going to be believed. So then they say, okay, so that's their attempt to prove the last case couldn't have been a case, because it doesn't have to do with Adam at all. It has to do with whether he ate there for 3 years or whether he was living there for 3 years or whether he wasn't. But then the Gemara says, okay, but that didn't prove anything about the father, why you specifically had to say the father. It would be the exact same thing with the father. If I claim I bought it from the father, it would be a problem, or it would be a question just as much as this was. If you were already there for 3 years, why wouldn't you be believed? And if you didn't eat there for 3 years or live there for 3 years, obviously it wouldn't be believed. So why was that the distinction? Okay, again, we're trying to figure out, why didn't it just give a simpler case? I purchased it from you. It was yours, but I purchased it from you. So they're now going to say why this only works for the father case. And basically what they're saying is this whole mission makes no sense, not according to the father, not according to if you bought it directly from the person, because it's not dependent on whether there were witnesses or whether a pesh asar or a pesh yitir. It's really dependent. Were you there for 3 years? Well, you're not there for 3 years. If you're not there for 3 years, you can't claim anything. Or at least if the Eidim were there, you wouldn't be able to claim anything. And that would be obvious. You wouldn't need to say it. If there were no Eidim, maybe yes. Okay. But if Eidim are there, it's obvious. You don't need a Mishna to tell you that. Okay. And if it's the other, if you were there for 3 years, then obviously you believed whether there's witnesses that said the person owned it before you or not. So either which way, we don't really understand why specifically the father and really why they're even telling us this case. So now they say, no, this is the case. The only case you could really make sense that we have something new to teach you in the Mishnah is if it's the father. Why? You say it was owned by your father and who's no longer alive. Here's your case. This is the case we need the Mishnah to tell you that it really depends whether it's a pesh asar or a pesh yitil, or witnesses already told us, and then it wouldn't work. If the first 2 years, the father was still alive, and the third year, the son, and the son was a minor. You can't claim chazak in that case, because the whole thing of chazak is based on he didn't complain. Now, if he's a young minor, he doesn't know what property his father owned. Maybe when he gets older, he'll look into it and he'll find out. But when he was a minor, he had no idea. So basically, even when he gets older, and now there's a debate about how exactly to understand this. Some people say, even when he gets older, even if 3 years pass, we don't even count that, because the point is when his father was still alive, he was a minor. The father may have never told him. So the fact he doesn't protest has nothing to do with his ability to know what actually happened, right? How many times do we have situations where people's parents die young, or one parent, and they don't know information about them because no one ever told them? They were too young for the parents to tell them early. They never had the luxury of having a parent when they were older to tell them all sorts of things about their past, about their, about their properties, all sorts of things like that. So therefore, chazaka doesn't work in a case like that. And that's why it had to be a case with the father, because the 3-year chazaka that we kind of use as a question is a combo in this case. Part was from the father, part was from the minor, and that's why we can't. That's why, again, now what does that explain? That explains that when it's a pesh asar or a pesh yitir, we'll believe him. But when witnesses come, we're not going to believe him. And that's the real chiddush. We're not going to believe him. Why? Isn't it obvious we're not going to believe him? Well, it's not so obvious. The point here is there was a chazaka. And even though there was a chazaka, we're still not going to believe him because we don't count chazaka in this case at all. And that's Rav Huna's halacha. So now, because I'm Rav Huna, so now the Gemara asks, wait a minute. If that's what our Mishna is teaching us, the way we just explained it, Rav Huna, then Rav Huna is basically teaching us something that was said in explicit Mishnah. No reason to do that. Well, Ibait Ema, Rav Huna diukut matnitin kamar. First of all, it wasn't the simple reading of the Mishnah. We had to get there. And what Rav Huna is doing is explaining to us that's what the Mishnah means. Alternatively, Ibait Ema, afilu hidil kamashma. Maybe he's trying to teach us the chiddush about even if when he gets older, we don't allow it. Okay, and that wasn't something that was so clear from the Mishnah. Then the Gemara says, well, if that's really what the Mishnah was talking about, it was 2 years of the father, 1 year of the son. Well, then, sorry. If, right, you could come up, if you were already distinguishing 2 years like this, 1 year like that, we could come up with another case where it actually is the person himself and not that you purchased it from the father. Because it's always a simpler case to say, I purchased it from you, so let's come up with a case. Why don't we talk about him? That I purchased it directly from you. The first 2 years I ate, you were in town. The third year, you were out of town. Let's say you ran away. And then that third year, since you would run away, you didn't assume responsibility. You meant to be around, you weren't home, and you meant like the first 2 years, okay, I have another year, I'll protest next year. And then you end up having to run away, and then you never protested. So now the Gemara is going to say, well, barach machmat mai. What did you run away from? If it was your life was in danger, Pshita de lo meheman, de lo matze mache. Well, then it wasn't your fault at all that you didn't protest. So therefore, of course, right, we're not going to count the fact that you didn't protest, and my chazaka is meaningless. And therefore, it's obvious that if there's witnesses that say it was yours, I'm not believing. V'id, and then you wouldn't need the Mishna to tell you that. Id barach machmat mamon, if you ran off because you had some financial issue, either you were running away from someone who was trying to collect money from you and you didn't have the money to pay, you should have protested. Why? In other words, if you ran away to get away from money lenders or something, so when you're in the other city that you ran away to, you should protest there. And then you can always bring witnesses. Look, I protested there. How do we know this? As we hold, if you protest not in front of me, but in a different city, that actually works. You can claim, listen, I protested. I wasn't in front of him, but I was able to. It's not, how do we know this? And then basically that proves that you couldn't have brought that case because either you ran away from nefashot, in which case my chazak is meaningless, in which case obviously we're going to believe the witnesses. You don't need a mission to tell you that. Or we don't believe chazak is meaningless here. I'm sorry. We believe me because 3 years have passed, and even though you were abroad for monetary issues, you could have put in a protest wherever you were. And since you didn't, therefore the land is mine. And then the second part of the Mishna wouldn't be true, because the second part of the Mishna said, if there's witnesses, he has witnesses, then it's not mine. But if I was sitting there for 3 years and you didn't protest, even if you were abroad one of those years, it wouldn't matter. So now we're just left with to understand where we know macha shelo b'fanav is macha'at, and for that we'll end today's shiur. Ditnan, shalosh aratzot l'chazaka. There's 3 different areas when it comes when it talks about chazaka. Yehuda, Ever HaYarden, v'Hagalil. Okay, the Judea, the others, the Transjordan, and the Galil. The Galil. You were in Judea and you ended up having a chazaka in the Galil. In other words, the owner was in Yehuda and you did the chazaka in the Galil, or b'Galil and Sif Yehuda. Ain't a chazaka ad she'emo b'mdina. If he's living in the total other section of the country, he won't know necessarily that you're living there, and therefore it doesn't count. And they asked on this Mishna, what does he hold this Tana? If you hold protesting from far away is a protest, well then, even if you're in Yehuda and he's in the Gamliel, or she's in the Gamliel, right, they can protest and it doesn't really matter. It should count. And if you think that if you're not right in front of me and I don't see you protesting, it's irrelevant, well then afilu Yehuda v'Yehuda nami. Then there shouldn't be designated areas. It's anyone who's not in the face of. You could be in the neighboring town, but protested not in front of me, it wouldn't even count. So Amar Rav Abba Bar Mama La'olam, how does he explain this Mishna? La'olam kasavar macha shelo b'fanav havi macha. Really, it is a macha even if you're not there. But matnitim b'shat chirum dami. It's only when it's shat chirum, an emergency time where there's no communication between one area and the other. Umayshna Yehuda v'Galil denakat. Why did they specifically say the Judea and the Gamliel if it's talking about any kind of emergency situation where there's no communication between 2 areas? In general, those 2 areas were like a shat chirum because they weren't allowed, or they weren't able to communicate with each other. And that explains, again, from this Mishna, it's clear the macha shelo b'fanav would count. It just doesn't in this case because there's no communication at all between the 2 places. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov.